You didn't wake up one day suddenly exhausted. It happened slowly, quietly, through unanswered messages, through conversations where you listened more than you were heard, through the subtle feeling of being present but not chosen. And the most confusing part, you weren't asking for too much. You were asking for consistency, for effort, for clarity. You kept telling yourself, maybe he's busy. You kept adjusting your expectations downward, hoping love would meet you halfway. But deep inside, there's a calm ache now, not desperation, awareness. This message isn't about making him chase you. It's about what happens when you finally stop chasing him. And why, if he doesn't move after that, you don't argue with silence. You listen to it. Let's talk about what really shifts when a woman pulls back, not out of games, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. When your energy stops feeding his comfort at first, he doesn't notice your absence the way you expect. And that's important to understand because it protects you from misreading the silence. When you pull back, you're often looking for an immediate reaction, some clear signal that says, yes, he feels it, but that's not how comfort works. Comfort doesn't scream when it's gone, it whispers. It lingers, it assumes it will return. A man doesn't instantly miss what made his life easier. He misses what disrupts his sense of normal. And your energy, your emotional availability, your consistent presence, those things quietly became part of his normal. Not because he consciously chose to take them for granted, but because human nature adapts quickly to what feels steady and safe. He doesn't wake up thinking, she made me feel secure. He wakes up expecting that security to still be there. What he notices first isn't pain, it's silence. The emotional background noise goes quiet. That message that used to come in right on time doesn't arrive. That familiar warmth in the conversation feels different. That sense of being emotionally held, without him having to ask for it, fades. And here's the key part. He didn't realize how much he was leaning on it. You used to check in not because you were needy, but because you were attentive. You used to ask how his day was even when your own day felt heavy, because that's how you love. You used to make emotional space for him to exist exactly as he was without demanding that he show up fully in return. You weren't chasing. And then, without saying a word, you stop. Not in protest, not to prove a point, not with explanations that drain you even further. You simply withdraw your presence. Your replies are still kind, but they're no longer immediate. Your tone is still warm, but it's no longer compensating. Your energy is no longer filling emotional gaps that were never yours to fill. And that's the moment the shift begins. This is the first real change, even though it looks quiet on the outside. His comfort is interrupted. Comfort is powerful. Comfort is subtle. Comfort is dangerous when it goes unquestioned. It makes people relax into roles without evaluating their responsibility. It makes effort feel optional. It creates the illusion that things will continue simply because they always have. Comfort tells a man, you don't need to do more. She's got it. So when your energy stops feeding that comfort, something inside him stirs, not panic, not fear, just a faint sense of imbalance. Something feels off, but he can't name it yet. There's no argument to respond to, no complaint to defend against, no emotional outburst to dismiss. There is only absence. And absence is unsettling precisely because it offers no explanation. It forces the mind to fill in the blanks. It removes the emotional safety cushion he didn't even realize was there. This is when his body feels it before his mind understands it. The day feels slightly emptier. The conversation feels unfinished. The emotional rhythm feels different. And for the first time, he's alone with that feeling. That's when truth starts surfacing, not through logic, not through words, but through sensation, through the subtle discomfort of losing access to something he assumed was permanent. Your energy was regulating the connection. Your attention was stabilizing it. Your presence was smoothing over inconsistencies. When that disappears, reality becomes clearer. And here's the part that matters for you. This shift has nothing to do with punishment. It has everything to do with self-respect. You didn't withdraw to make him feel something. You withdrew because you stopped abandoning yourself to keep him comfortable. That's why this moment is powerful, because now the connection has to stand on its own, without your emotional labor holding it together, without your constant availability cushioning his inaction. If he leans forward now, it's because he finally feels the absence of what you were giving. And if he doesn't, it's because the comfort mattered more than the connection. Either way, you gain clarity. When your energy stops feeding his comfort, you stop bleeding yourself quietly. You reclaim your emotional strength. You step out of the role of emotional provider and back into the role of a woman who knows her presence is not background noise. It's a gift, and gifts are felt most deeply when they're no longer freely assumed. When silence forces him to feel what he avoided, men don't always process emotions in real time. They process them in absence. That doesn't make them careless or incapable. It makes them different. Emotion for many men isn't something they sit with while it's happening. It's something that catches up to them when the noise stops, when the distraction ends, when there is finally nothing between them and their own thoughts. When you're always there, explaining your feelings carefully, softening your needs, adjusting your expectations, he never has to fully face himself. Your presence absorbs the emotional impact. Your voice fills the silence before it becomes uncomfortable. Your patience smooths over moments that might have forced reflection. You weren't just showing up. You were buffering him from discomfort. Your consistency gave him emotional insulation. It allowed him to stay exactly as he was without consequence. Not because he meant to avoid growth, but because there was no space that required it. Comfort doesn't demand self-awareness. Silence does. And when you pull back calmly, without accusation, without dramatic explanation, something profound happens. There is nothing left to distract him from what he's been postponing. No conversation to steer. No emotion to manage. No reassurance arriving right on time to settle his nervous system. No reminder that you'll still be there no matter what. Silence doesn't shout, it doesn't accuse, it doesn't demand, it simply exists. And that existence removes emotional cushioning. Now he feels the gap, not in a theatrical way, not as heartbreak, but as a quiet disturbance. A moment where he reaches for the familiar and realizes it isn't immediately available. A pause where his usual assumptions don't get confirmed. This is where emotional awareness begins, not because someone explains it to him, because his body feels the absence. The rhythm of connection is off. The emotional equilibrium is gone. And for the first time, there's no one stepping in to regulate it for him. Silence forces internal conversation. Questions arise not because you asked them, but because your absence made them unavoidable. Why does this feel different? Why does the quiet feel heavier than expected? Why does this space feel unresolved? And here's the part many women misunderstand. Silence doesn't hurt them the way words do. Words can be argued with, defended against. Minimized silence can't be debated. It can't be dismissed. It lingers. In that lingering space, a man meets himself. He becomes aware of what he received without fully appreciating. He notices the emotional support that used to arrive effortlessly. He senses the weight of what he didn't have to carry before. This is not punishment. This is exposure. Silence exposes emotional patterns. It shows him where he leaned without giving, where he postponed responsibility, where he relied on your emotional availability to avoid his own introspection. And in that space, something critical happens. A man either grows or he stays exactly where he is. Growth looks like movement toward clarity, toward effort, toward emotional presence. Not grand gestures, but sincere shifts. A reaching out that isn't about reclaiming comfort, but about reestablishing connection with intention. Staying the same looks like stillness, avoidance. Distraction, filling the silence with noise rather than meaning. And this is where silence becomes your greatest source of truth, because it doesn't lie. It doesn't confuse. It doesn't send mixed signals. Silence shows you what a man does when there's no emotional cushion left. When there's no reassurance reminding him he's still secure. When there's no voice guiding him through what he should feel. If he steps forward, it's because the space taught him something. If he doesn't, it's because the space exposed his limits. And either outcome is clarity. Silence doesn't punish. It doesn't manipulate. It doesn't play games. It reveals emotional capacity. It reveals readiness. It reveals whether connection was mutual or maintained by your effort alone. And while he is processing in that quiet space, something equally important is happening for you. Your nervous system is settling. Your energy is returning to your body. You are no longer explaining yourself into exhaustion. You are no longer carrying emotional weight that was never shared. You begin to hear your own thoughts again. You begin to feel grounded instead of anxious. You begin to understand that peace doesn't come from being understood, comes from being aligned. Silence gives you both the same opportunity. For him, it's the chance to feel what he avoided. For you, it's the chance to stop avoiding yourself. And that is why silence is powerful, not because it controls outcomes, but because it strips them down to truth. When his ego has to answer a question he can't ignore, here's the part most people misunderstand, and it's important to slow down here because this isn't about tactics or strategies. A man doesn't chase because you disappear. Disappearing alone doesn't awaken anything meaningful. What shifts something inside him is not absence. It's the realization that his assumptions may have been wrong. A man chases when his ego realizes it miscalculated your availability. When you were always there, your value felt stable. Not because you lacked value, but because it felt guaranteed, predictable, safe. The human mind equates consistency with certainty, and certainty dulls urgency. It creates the quiet belief that access does not need to be earned again. You didn't lose value. Your value became assumed. An ego is comfortable with what it assumes it controls. But when you step back with dignity, not bitterness, not resentment, something destabilizes that internal narrative. You don't announce your withdrawal. You don't explain it away. You don't dramatize your distance. You simply stop overextending. You stop making yourself endlessly available. That quiet shift is what unsettles him, because now his ego no longer has confirmation. The familiar pattern breaks. The reassurance he unconsciously relied on doesn't show up. The certainty that you'll always be there begins to crack. An ego, more than anything, wants to understand where it stands. Quiet questions begin to surface, not because you planted them, but because the situation demands an answer. Did I underestimate her? Did I assume she'd stay no matter what? Is she actually okay without me? These questions aren't romantic at first. They're existential. Ego doesn't ask them out of love, it asks them out of self-preservation, because ego is deeply attached to relevance, to influence, to being wanted, and ego hates uncertainty more than rejection. Rejection has an answer. Uncertainty does not. When he doesn't know where he stands with you anymore, his internal sense of control is disrupted. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, unsettling one, the kind that lingers in the background of his thoughts, the kind that returns when distractions fade. This isn't manipulation, it's psychology. Human beings attach value to what is not guaranteed. Not because they're cruel or selfish, but because uncertainty forces reflection. It demands engagement. It interrupts autopilot. When a woman knows her worth and acts accordingly, she disrupts assumptions. She doesn't argue for her value. She demonstrates it through boundaries, through emotional restraint, through the calm decision to stop over giving. And ego responds to disruption, not because it suddenly becomes enlightened, but because it can no longer remain passive. Passivity relies on predictability. When predictability disappears, ego has to reassess. That reassessment is the moment of truth. If he reaches out now, it's not because you convinced him. It's not because you explained yourself better. It's not because you waited the right amount of time. It's because something inside him woke up. He realized that access to you was not unconditional. He realized that your presence was not permanent by default. He realized that you were choosing yourself, And that choice changed the equation. And if he doesn't reach out, that answer is just as important because it tells you something crucial about his emotional capacity, about whether his ego was attached to you as a source of comfort or whether he was capable of meeting you as an equal participant in connection. Ego awakening doesn't guarantee growth. Sometimes it leads to pursuit. Sometimes it leads to withdrawal. And both outcomes are information. What matters is that you are no longer trying to be understood. You are observing. You are grounded. You are no longer negotiating your worth through effort. You stop asking yourself why he isn't doing more. You start noticing whether he can. And that shift is powerful because your peace no longer depends on his response. Your clarity doesn't require his validation. Whether he steps forward or stays still, you are no longer guessing. When his ego is forced to answer a question it can't ignore, you finally get to see the truth without interference. And the truth, whatever it is, sets you free, not by making him chase, but by reminding you that you never needed to chase in the first place. When distance becomes a mirror, not a strategy, distance changes meaning when it's no longer used to provoke a reaction. When it's not deployed with hope or fear attached. When it isn't about waiting to see what he'll do so you can decide how to feel. True distance begins the moment you stop using it as a tool and start allowing it to show you what already exists. Because real distance doesn't create behavior. It reveals it. When you step back without drama, without explanation, without trying to control the outcome, the connection is left alone with itself. No emotional scaffolding, no reminders. No unspoken agreements being silently upheld by you. And what happens next is honest. You are no longer smoothing over the pauses. You are no longer carrying conversations. You are no longer initiating connection to keep it alive. You let the dynamic breathe, and breathing space exposes structure. Distance becomes a mirror because it reflects the true level of emotional investment on both sides. It shows whether the connection had mutual weight or whether it was sustained by your presence alone. It shows whether effort was shared or compensated for. This isn't coldness. It's clarity. When you stop compensating, you start seeing. You notice how quickly silence settles. You notice whether he leans in or drifts away. You notice whether curiosity about you still exists without prompting. And here's the important part. Distance removes confusion because it removes interference. You're no longer asking, what did he mean? You're no longer interpreting tone. You're no longer explaining behavior to yourself. You are watching actions unfold naturally. Distance strips away potential. It removes the what ifs. It takes away the fantasy of who he could be and leaves you with who he is. Right now, without your emotional effort supporting him, that can feel uncomfortable at first. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're no longer buffering yourself from truth. Distance brings emotional honesty to the surface, and honesty is quiet, not dramatic. If he steps forward in this space, it's not because you pulled away cleverly. It's because his desire to connect exists independent of your availability. He feels the absence not as rejection, but as an invitation to show up. If he doesn't step forward, it's not because you failed. It's because the connection required your constant presence to survive. Distance doesn't accuse, it doesn't demand, it doesn't chase, it simply holds still. And in stillness, patterns become visible. You start noticing how much peace enters your body when you stop overextending, how your thoughts slow down, how your emotions stabilize. Distance isn't just showing you him, it's showing you yourself. You realize how much of your anxiety came from managing the connection, how much of your exhaustion came from uncertainty, how much of your self-doubt came from waiting. Distance gives you your energy back. Not all at once, but gradually, quietly, the way you didn't notice it leaving. And the more grounded you become, the clearer everything looks. You stop needing signs. You stop looking for reassurance. You stop trying to decode silence. Because distance answers questions without words. It tells you whether he values access or connection, whether effort flows naturally or has to be extracted. whether emotional availability exists or has to be negotiated. Distance shows you whether a man can meet you where you are, or whether he was only comfortable when you came to him. And this is why distance is not a strategy. Strategies aim for outcomes. Mirrors show truth. Strategies create anxiety because they require results. Mirrors create calm because they reveal reality. When you understand this, you stop waiting with tension. You stop timing responses. You stop measuring silence. You let things unfold. And in that unfolding, you regain something far more important than control. You regain self-trust. You trust what you see. You trust what you feel. You trust your ability to walk away from what doesn't meet you. Distance doesn't make decisions for you. It makes them obvious. And when something becomes obvious, there is no confusion left to cling to. There is only choice. Choice grounded in self-respect. Choice rooted in clarity. Choice that doesn't need explanation. When distance becomes a mirror, you stop trying to be chosen. You start choosing yourself. When you realize you were doing the emotional labor, this realization doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't come with anger or confrontation. It settles into you slowly, like a quiet truth you can no longer ignore. You begin to notice how tired you feel after interactions that were supposed to feel warm. Not drained because something went wrong, but drained because something was always missing. And you were the one filling the gap. You start recognizing that the exhaustion wasn't emotional sensitivity. It was emotional responsibility carried alone. For a long time, you told yourself this was just how relationships work. That someone has to be more patient, more understanding, more emotionally available. And without meaning to, that someone became you. You were the one checking in when the energy shifted. You were the one explaining feelings so they wouldn't be misunderstood. You were the one softening your needs so they wouldn't feel like pressure. You weren't demanding, you weren't dramatic, you were accommodating. And accommodation, when it goes unreciprocated, quietly turns into labor. You start realizing that you weren't just showing up. You were maintaining the emotional climate. You were monitoring tone, timing, mood. You were adjusting your expectations to avoid disappointment. You were anticipating his emotional state and responding accordingly, often before he even expressed anything. That's not connection. That's emotional management. And the moment this awareness clicks, something inside you shifts. You notice how often conversations depended on your initiation, how emotional closeness appeared only when you reached for it, how misunderstandings were resolved because you chose peace over clarity. You weren't meeting him halfway. You were walking the whole distance and calling it compromise. This realization can feel heavy at first, not because you regret loving deeply, but because you see how much of yourself you gave without noticing the cost. You see how much emotional energy you invested just to keep things from falling apart. And here's the important part. Emotional labor is invisible when you're inside it. It feels like love. It feels like effort. It feels like patience. But once you step back, you recognize it by the imbalance it leaves behind. You notice how quiet it becomes when you stop initiating. You notice how unresolved things remain when you stop fixing them. You notice how little emotional movement happens without your involvement. That's not absence, that's exposure. And this is where many women feel a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for how long they carried something that wasn't shared. Relief because the truth finally has a shape. You begin to understand that love doesn't require constant explanation, that emotional safety shouldn't depend on one person's endurance. That being understanding doesn't mean being self-erasing. You weren't asking for too much. You were doing too much. And when you realize that, you stop blaming yourself for feeling tired. You stop wondering why things felt off even when nothing was wrong. You see that imbalance doesn't announce itself loudly. It wears you down quietly. As you pull back from emotional labor, your nervous system responds first. Your body relaxes. Your thoughts slow. You're no longer scanning for signals or preparing emotional responses. You're simply present with yourself. And in that space, clarity arrives. You see whether he steps in or stays still, whether he notices the shift or remains comfortable in your absence, whether emotional effort was mutual or